Hi there, everybody. It's good to be back with you today. I missed last week because an update to WordPress completely mangled my site, but we are back on track and things are looking pretty good. So, it's time to talk about adding the drums to this recording. Drums are potentially a giant subject in and of themselves, and I could probably spend hours and hours of video talking about just them, in much the same way as I could spend hours and hours of video talking about vocal tracks, guitar tracks, bass tracks, whatever. With that in mind, the purpose of this video is pretty much to just hit the highlights and talk about overall ideas and how those ideas got implemented. A major overarching idea that I want to talk about right away is that when you hear these drums naked, that is, without the rest of the mix around them, they're going to sound pretty bizarre. And they may not sound like the drums that you might want to have. I think it's important to note that for this particular project, my concern was to leave a lot of the mid-range traffic for the guitar, bass, and vocals. And so what that meant is taking a lot of that mid-range out of the drums. And so the kick is going to sound kind of bizarre. The toms are going to sound kind of bizarre. The snare has a fair amount of mid-range in it because there was only so far I could go. But the thing with mixing is that sometimes you do very strange things to get everything to stick together in a way that pleases you in an overall sense. So, to get started, let's listen to the kick drum dry, just as it was recorded. Now, based on what I said in my introduction, you're probably guessing that this kick drum is the exact opposite of what I wanted in my mix. And you're exactly right. I wanted a kick drum with lows, and I wanted a kick drum with a high-end click and pretty much nothing else. And so the way that I chose to get this result was by creating a dual signal path inside my kick drum channel. And in that path, I put a very selective bandpass filter to get the bottom end of the drum. And then I put a very selective bandpass filter in the other signal path to isolate the high frequency click of the drum. When I got that all done, this is what it sounded like. At this point, I was pretty much happy with the tonality of the kick drum. What I wasn't quite sure that I liked was the amount of ring on the low end. This is kind of a nitpicky thing, but in the moment I thought, well, I'd like to shorten that up. And so in the low frequency section of the channel, I added a gate, with the purpose being to tighten up that low frequency response without changing what the high end click was doing. So there was my rock and roll kick drum. I should definitely emphasize, if you were just getting into this kind of work, that doing something this extreme to a kick drum is not necessarily something that I recommend that you have as a go-to first try method for everything. For instance, in jazz, a big part of how the kick drum expresses itself is the mid-range. You do not want to turn a jazz kit into something that sounds like Pantera. So you need to know what your context is before you go wielding all the knobs and making things sound totally weird. In this case, it worked. After doing some pretty standard work on the snare, it was time to move on to the toms. Most of the time with toms, I will bus them all together and then do whatever I need to do with them as a group. I find that this tends to preserve the overall feel that the drummer was going for. And since I spend most of my time working with pretty darn competent drummers, I usually don't have to worry about doing a lot of microsurgery on each individual drum. Usually the drummer will have figured out how they want their kit to sound as a whole, and then I just need to take that and not worry about every little thing, but just kind of shape an overall sound. Since there wasn't a lot of tom playing in the section of the recording that I've been using so far, I'm going to switch to a different part of what we got that night to display how I worked on the toms. So just like the kick, the tom recording was pretty okay, just coming in, but it wasn't what I wanted for the mix as it was shaping up. So again, first thing to do was yank a lot of the mid-range out and create a tom sound that had a lot of click, quote unquote, in it. At this point, I was starting to worry that what I had done had maybe mangled the tom's attack a little too much. And so I got out a neat little piece of gear, or, well, in this case, a virtual piece of gear, a plugin, that's called a transient controller. A transient controller is a dynamics processor that works rather differently from other dynamics processors. It does increase and decrease dynamic range, but one, it can selectively increase and decrease the dynamic range of specific parts of the signal, like, say, the attack and the sustain, and it does not work in a traditional threshold sort of sense. That is, you don't set some level for it to start working, and then when the signal crosses that threshold, the transient controller starts doing something. Instead, the transient controller uses an envelope follower on the signal. And what this means is that the processor can sense, independently of absolute level, when a signal is, for instance, changing very quickly in the upwards direction or changing slowly in the downwards direction. And from this, the processor can essentially make a simple logic decision about what to do. In this case, I set the transient controller to increase the dynamic range of the attack portion of the signal. As a side note, if the change that I just made isn't really jumping out at you, I totally understand, because it's not really jumping out at me anymore either. It's one of those things that, in the moment, you dial it up, you think you hear enough of a difference to change your mind, and you go with it. And that's okay. That's enough to make a decision with. At this point, I wanted to add compression to the toms. Now, this may seem a little strange because I just talked about increasing the dynamic range of the attack portion of the toms, and now here I am talking about reducing the dynamic range of the overall signal. Again, this is a case, like I've talked about before, of using different processors against each other to get a different total output. The important thing to understand is that the compressor is not going to produce a one-to-one undo of what the transient controller did. Instead, it's going to reduce the dynamic range of the signal in a way that's different than what it would have done if the signal had not had the transient controller applied before. When I put everything together, this is what I ended up with. With this all being done, I thought to myself, well, the drum still needs something. Maybe some reverb would help. And so I put a reverb generator across the entire drum bus. Now, wait a minute, you're saying? You put the reverb generator across the entire drum bus? Uh, do you actually want kick drum in the reverb? And here's my thing. The answer is yes. To borrow the wording of the engineer who calls himself Slipperman on a few forums, anyone who has heard a real kick drum in a real room knows that kick drums have reverb on them. They interact with the room just like everything else. And so I am not at all worried about the kick drum getting into my reverb generator. In fact, I actually kind of like the sound. Of course, you are absolutely free to think this is crazy and not like it and not do it yourself, but that's my rationale. That's all there is for this video. We're closing in on the end of this project. The next video will be all about the process of working on the mix as a whole, something that you could arguably call mastering. So anyway, I'll see you then, and I hope before we get to that point that you will also take the time to come visit me at smallvenuesurvivalist.com.